This is number 48 in my series, Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. Today is July 4th, 2026, making it the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. It's also the 200th anniversary of the deaths of both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. Exactly 200 years ago today, on this date, July 4th, 1826, both Thomas Jefferson and John Adams died a few hours apart from each other. What are the odds that these two giants of American independence would both die on the same day, and that it would be July 4th? But this story is much more than just a discussion about their deaths. It's the story of their friendship, which had some unexpected twists and turns. They started as friends and then became political opponents, then later in life resumed their friendship stronger than before. Their letters to each other are very personal, and after 1818, when Abigail Adams died, they were lonely widowers, and they often comforted each other. In this special podcast, we'll spend some time reading excerpts of some of the letters that they wrote to each other. Adams and Jefferson became close friends during the struggles for independence. During sessions of the Continental Congress, John Adams was an outspoken proponent of independence from Great Britain. Jefferson didn't say much during the debates. Everyone knew that his talent was in writing, not in debating or speaking. Both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were appointed to be on the committee along with Ben Franklin that would draft the Declaration of Independence. Franklin declined to do the writing because he didn't like to be the author of documents that would be up for public scrutiny or debate. So John Adams insisted that Thomas Jefferson do the writing since he was a much better writer. So in a way, you could say that John Adams was the voice of independence while Jefferson was the author of independence. Adams and Jefferson came from very different worlds. John Adams was outspoken. He spoke his mind, and he was very opinionated. He was often very earthy, almost borderline vulgar in his speech and in the way that he described things. But overall, he was a good public speaker. John Adams was from New England, Massachusetts specifically, which had a very different culture and societal arrangement than did Virginia, which is where Jefferson was from. John Adams was of Puritan background, which sometimes made him moralistic and judgmental. And John Adams was not born into wealth or even in the highest position of society. He had to kind of work his way up. Thomas Jefferson, on the other hand, was reserved in his personal communications with others. He said little during debates, but was a talented and gifted writer. Jefferson was born in the very highest tiers of Virginia planter society and was truly part of the elite that ran Virginia. Jefferson was an intellectual, and he was influenced by deism, which is a type of philosophical approach that intellectuals used to approach religion. He was a deep thinker who enjoyed pondering philosophical questions and exploring ideas. Jefferson also enjoyed scientific investigation and even doing experimenting, kind of like Ben Franklin. He had a little Ben Franklin in him. Both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, though, were both lawyers. Both Adams and Jefferson were voracious readers. They both loved the books. In fact, Thomas Jefferson's personal library became the nucleus around which the Library of Congress was formed. On the screen right now is a presidential succession chart, which gives you an idea of the chronology. This will be useful as we talk about the events that brought John Adams and Thomas Jefferson together and then divided them, and then the chronology of their kind of getting back together as friends, as we'll see as we read some of those letters. The chart takes us through the presidencies of George Washington. He served 2 terms, through John Quincy Adams' second term, or the last of his second term, which ended in 1829. It's ironic that John Adams died while his son, John Quincy Adams, was president. That would have had to have been an interesting time for him as well. And he was the president that had to issue the executive order honoring their deaths. As I mentioned earlier, Adams and Jefferson were close friends during the Revolution, but became political opponents with a degree of bitterness sometimes even. During George Washington's administration, as you can kind of see in the chart, 2 political parties formed. I designated them with those 2 gray lines that go off, one above and one below the timeline. Jefferson and Adams ended up in 2 different parties, which alone caused some contention. As you can see on the chart, John Adams, along with Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was really the leader of the Federalist Party. And then down below the timeline, you can see that Jefferson as well as James Madison were the leaders of the Republican Party. The newspapers back then were no better, maybe even worse than the ones we have today. Very scurrilous things were said. Highly personal attacks were made. Sometimes things were just simply made up. And this, of course, drew the leaders of both of the 2 parties into the vortex of conflict. I think that this whole dynamic probably increased during John Adams' presidency. He served 1 term, you can see there. because during his term, Thomas Jefferson was vice president, so in effect, they were the two leaders of the two different parties. The election of 1800 was a very bitter election. Jefferson and another Republican, Aaron Burr, had a tie vote. Therefore, it fell to the House of Representatives to pick the president. They had several ballots before they could pick one. They eventually chose Thomas Jefferson, but there was already a lot of animosity between he and John Adams. In fact, when Adams' term expired that night, he left Washington in the darkness without sticking around for Jefferson's inauguration. And after that, they didn't have much to do with each other for many years. For the balance of this podcast, we're going to look at how Thomas Jefferson and John Adams reestablished their friendship, which took some time. We're going to do that primarily by reading excerpts from some of their letters and their replies to each other. The letters reveal two friends whose friendship never really died, but was simply put on the shelf because both of them were hurt by each other. And if their letters are any gauge, I think that their friendship was actually stronger by the time they died than it was before their falling out. It's also very interesting how big of a part Abigail Adams, who was John Adams' wife, played in this friendship and then getting them back together as well, because she wrote letters to Thomas Jefferson. We'll look at a little bit of that too. It's interesting as they progressed towards old age and death, how much they comforted each other during their times of sorrow and sadness and the aging process. Kind of makes me think hopefully that each one of us has a friend like that. We're going to take these letters in chronological order, and I'll leave this presidential succession diagram up on the screen so you can see how the letters fit into the scheme of things chronologically. So this first letter I want to read from is from 1804, and what had happened is Thomas Jefferson's daughter had died, and the author of the letter is not John Adams, but Abigail Adams, who was John Adams' wife. She had also become a good friend of Thomas Jefferson, and she was also felt very wounded by the conflict that her husband and Thomas Jefferson were having, and she had some anger towards Jefferson, as we'll see in a few minutes here. She was very close to Jefferson's daughter, in fact, kind of acted as a mother to her a little bit, and I think Abigail was trying to console Jefferson, as well as maybe herself. She felt bad about this death. In her opening paragraph, Abigail writes to Jefferson saying, "Reasons of various kinds withheld my pen until the powerful feelings of my heart have burst through the restraint and called upon me to shed the tear of sorrow over the departed remains of your beloved and deserving daughter, an event which I most sincerely mourn." Now, Abigail and John had also lost a child, and so she writes, "I have tasted the bitter cup and bow with reverence and humility before the great dispenser of it all, without whose permission and overruling providence not a sparrow falls to the ground, that you may derive comfort and consolation in this day of your sorrow and affliction, from that only source calculated to heal the wounded heart. A firm belief in the being, perfections, and attributes of God is the sincere and ardent wish of her who once took pleasure in subscribing herself your friend, Abigail Adams." Jefferson responded by saying, "Dear Madam, the affectionate sentiments which you have the goodness to express in your letter of May 20 toward my dear departed daughter have awakened in me sensibilities natural to the occasion and recalled your kindness to her, which I shall ever remember with gratitude and friendship. I can assure you with truth they had made an indelible impression upon my mind, and that to the last, on our meetings after long separations, whether I had heard lately of you and how you did, were among the earliest of her inquiries." And then Jefferson goes into some of the things that hurt him that John Adams did, which kind of stirs up a hornet's nest. So he says, "I can say with truth that one act of Mr. Adams' life, and only one, ever gave me a moment's personal displeasure. I did consider his last appointments to office as personally unkind. They were from among my most ardent political enemies, from whom no faithful cooperation could ever be expected, and laid me under the embarrassment of acting through men whose views were to defeat mine or to encounter the odium of putting others in their places. If my respect for him did not permit me to ascribe the whole blame to the influence of others, it left something for friendship to forgive, and after brooding over it for some time, and not always resisting the expression of it, I forgave it cordially, and returned to the same state of esteem and respect for him which had so long subsisted. That you may both be favored with health, tranquility, and long life is the prayer of one who tenders you the assurances of his highest consideration and esteem. Signed, Thomas Jefferson." So in response to what Jefferson wrote, Abigail writes back, and like I said, he kind of opened a hornet's nest. She said, "I have never felt any enmity toward you, sir, for being elected President of the United States. But the instruments made use of, and the means which were practiced to effect the change, have my utter abhorrence and detestation, for they were the blackest calumny and foulest falsehoods. I think she's there talking about the newspapers, because Jefferson had newspapers favorable to him, which he supported, and the Federalists had ones supporting them as well. And now for the real fireworks. Abigail goes on to say, "And now, sir, I will freely disclose to you what has severed the bonds of former friendship and placed you in a light very different from what I once viewed you in. One of the first acts of your administration was to liberate a wretch who was suffering the just punishment of the law due to his crimes for writing and publishing the basest libel, the lowest and vilest slander which malice could invent or calumny exhibit against the character and reputation of your predecessor," which means John Adams, "of him for whom you protest the highest esteem and friendship, and whom you certainly knew capable of such complicated baseness." She goes on to say, "Often I have wished to have seen a different course pursued by you. I bear no malice, I cherish no enmity. I would not retaliate if I could, nay, more in the true spirit of Christian charity, I would forgive as I hope to be forgiven. And with that disposition of mind and heart, I subscribe the name of Abigail Adams." So I think this letter shows that some of the hard feelings were still there between both of them. So this next letter was written in January 1st, 1812, New Year's Day. This is a letter that John Adams wrote, and he kind of breaks the ice here. He and Jefferson hadn't corresponded with each other for many years, in fact, over a decade, I believe. So he tells Jefferson he's sending him some things, he gives him some news about his family, and then he ends his letter by saying, "I wish you, sir, many happy New Years, and that you may enter the next and many succeeding years with as animating prospects for the public as those at present before us. I am, sir, with the long and sincere esteem, your friend and servant, John Adams." Jefferson responded by saying, "A letter from you calls up recollections very dear to my mind. It carries me back to the times when, beset with difficulties and dangers, we were fellow laborers in the same cause, struggling for what is most valuable to men, his right of self-government." And then Jefferson reports this interesting thing. He says, "Of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, I see now living not more than half a dozen on your side of the Potomac, and on this side myself alone. You and I have been wonderfully spared." And then he ends the letter by saying, "No circumstances have lessened the interest I feel in these particulars respecting yourself. None have suspended for one moment my sincere esteem for you, and I now salute you with an unchanged affections and respect." Signed, Thomas Jefferson. Adams responded with a show of good faith by saying, "I have uniformly treated the charges of corruption which I have read in the newspapers and pamphlets and heard from the pulpit against you. You and Mr. Madison had as good a right to your opinions as I had to mine, and I must acknowledge the nation was with you, but neither your authority nor that of the nation has convinced me, nor, I am bold to pronounce, will convince posterity. I am still as ever have been and ever shall be, with great esteem and regard, your friend and servant, John Adams." This next letter exchange is very interesting, and it results in the final reconciliation between Jefferson and Abigail. They become friends again. So at the end of one of John Adams' letters to Thomas Jefferson, Abigail adds her own postscript, and she writes to Thomas, she says, "I have been looking for some time for a space in my good husband's letters to add the regards of an old friend, which are still cherished and preserved through all the charges and vicissitudes which have taken place since we first became acquainted, and will, I trust, remain." In response, Jefferson writes, "Dear Madam, a kind note at the foot of Mr. Adams' letter of July 15th reminds me of the duty of saluting you with friendship and respect, a duty long suspended by the unremitting labors of public engagement, and which ought to have been sooner revived, since I have become proprietor of my own time." He then goes on to write, "However, I will now take time to ask you how you do, how you have done, and to express the interest I take in whatever affects your happiness. I have been concerned to learn that at one time you suffered much and long." So from this letter exchange, we gather that Jefferson and Abigail Adams have basically reconciled their differences. They don't feel bitter towards each other anymore. Jefferson goes on to finish his letter to Abigail by saying, "Under all circumstances of health or sickness, of blessing or affliction, I tender you assurances of my sincere affection and respect, and my prayers that the hand of time and of providence may press lightly on you, till your own wishes shall withdraw you from all mortal feeling." Signed, Thomas Jefferson. That was a letter exchange from 1813. This next letter exchange is from 1816. It's probably one of the most interesting letter exchanges that Jefferson and Adams had. It's certainly one of my favorites. They get deeply philosophical, and they ask each other very personal questions about life in general. John Adams starts off the letter exchange on a letter written March 2nd, 1816, and he says, "I cannot be serious. I am about to write you the most frivolous letter you've ever read." And then he asks Jefferson this question, saying, "Would you go back to your cradle and live over again your 70 years?" And then Adams gives his own opinion about what he would say or what he would have to take into account to answer that question himself. He says the question involves so many considerations of metaphysics and physics, of theology and ethics, of philosophy and history, of experience and romance, of tragedy and comedy and farce, that I would not give my opinion without writing a volume to justify it. Jefferson then responds with this answer. He says, "You ask if I would agree to live my 70 or rather 73 years over again, to which I say, yea, I think with you that it is a good world on the whole, that it has been framed on a principle of benevolence and more pleasure than pain dealt out to us. I steer my bark with hope in the head, leaving fear astern. My hopes indeed sometimes fail, but not oftener than the forebodings of the gloomy. There are, I acknowledge, even in the happiest life, some terrible convulsions, heavy set-offs against the opposite page of the account." And then Jefferson kind of turns the tables and asks Adams this interesting question. He says, "I have often wondered for what good end the sensations of grief could be intended. All our other passions within proper bounds have an useful object. I wish the pathologists then would tell us what is the use of grief in the economy, and of what good is it the cause proximate or remote?" In asking this question, we have to keep in mind that so many of Jefferson's family members had died, and his wife had died young, and he'd been a bachelor ever since. He never remarried. So he's wondering why we have to experience grief or misery. In his response, John Adams writes back saying, "In your letter of April 8th, you wonder for what good end the sensations of grief could be intended. In the first place, however, we know not the connection between pleasure and pain. They seem to be mechanical and inseparable. It should seem that grief as a mere passion must necessarily be in proportion to sensitivity. Did you ever see a portrait or a statue of a great man without perceiving strong traits of pain and anxiety? These furrows were all plowed in the countenance by grief. They were aged men who had been tossed and buffeted in the vicissitudes of life, forced upon profound reflection by grief and disappointments, and taught to command their passions and prejudices. Grief drives men into habits of serious reflection, sharpens the understanding, and softens the heart. It compels them to rouse their reason, assert its empire over their passions, propensities, and prejudices, to elevate them to a superiority over all human events. In short, to make them Stoics and Christians." So this next letter is a letter written in 1818. It was from Thomas Jefferson to John Adams to help console Adams about the death of his wife Abigail. Now keep in mind, Jefferson's wife had died decades earlier, so he was familiar with the grief of having lost a beloved spouse. Jefferson writes, "Tried myself in the school of affliction by the loss of every form of connection which can rive the human heart. I know well and feel what you have lost, what you have suffered, are suffering, and have yet to endure. The same trials have taught me that, for ills so immeasurable, time and silence are the only medicines. I will not, therefore, by useless condolences, open afresh the sluices of your grief." And then from here, Jefferson gets interesting because he talks about the hopes for the future when we meet again in the next life, apparently, with our loved ones and the happiness we'll feel with that. He says, "It is of some comfort to us both that the term is not very distant at which we are to deposit in the same cerement our sorrows and suffering bodies, and to ascend in essence to an estate meeting with the friends we have loved and lost, and whom we shall still love and never lose again." Adams responded by writing, "Your letter of November 13th gave great delight, not only by the divine consolation it afforded me under my great affliction, but as it gave me full proof of your restoration to health. While you live, I seem to have a bank at Monticello on which I can draw for a letter of friendship and entertainment when I please." Adams then also goes on to talk about the afterlife and the meeting that takes place there. He says, "I know not how to prove physically that we shall meet and know each other in a future state. My reasons for believing are that I cannot conceive such a being, meaning God, could make such a species as the human merely to live and die on this earth. If I did not believe a future state, I should believe in no God. This universe, this all, would appear with all its swelling pomp a boyish firework. And if there be a future state, why should the Almighty dissolve forever all the tender ties which unite us so delightfully in this world, and forbid us to see each other in the next? All right, this last letter exchange that I want to read from is from 1823. It's just a little under 3 years before they died. And John Adams starts it off. He writes to Jefferson saying, "As you write so easily and so well, I pray you to write me as often as possible, for nothing revives my spirits so much as your letters, except the society of my son and his family, who are now happily with me after an absence of 2 years." Jefferson responded by writing, "Dear Sir, I do not write with the ease which your letter of September 18th supposes. Crippled wrists and fingers make writing slow and laborious. But while writing to you, I lose the sense of these things in the recollection of ancient times, when youth and health made happiness out of everything. I forget for a while the hoary winter of age, when we can think of nothing but how to keep ourselves warm, and how to get rid of our heavy hours until the friendly hand of death shall rid us of all at once." Now, before reading the rest of Jefferson's response, I have to mention that there had been a newspaper editorial that had caused some conflict, and maybe had given both Jefferson and Adams some worries that maybe their old wounds might be open, and Jefferson takes pains to make sure to let John Adams know that that's not the case. Jefferson wrote that he would not let anything disturb the repose of affections so sweetening to the evening of our lives. "Be assured, my dear sir, that I am incapable of receiving the slightest impression from the effort now made to plant thorns on the pillow of age, and to sow tares between friends who have been such for nearly half a century. Beseeching you then not to suffer your mind to be disquieted by this wicked attempt to poison its peace, and praying you to throw it by, amongst the things which have never happened, I add sincere assurances of my unabated and constant attachment, friendship, and respect." By July 1st, 1826, both Jefferson and Adams were both on their deathbeds and barely conscious. Both of them were determined to stay alive long enough to see July 4th. Jefferson awoke on July 3rd at about 7 p.m., apparently asking if it was July 4th yet. His doctor gave him a dose of laudanum, which he refused, saying, "No, doctor, nothing more." On July 4th, at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Jefferson died. John Adams was barely conscious when the sun arose on July 4th. To make him more comfortable, they changed his position and told him it was July 4th, to which he said, "It is a great day, it is a good day," and then a thunderstorm rolled in. Late in the afternoon, Adams, in a faint voice, said, "Thomas Jefferson survives." This statement that Adams made about Jefferson surviving is worth thinking about for a minute. They lived hundreds of miles apart. There were no fast means of communications back then like there are today, so how would Adams know anything at all about Jefferson's condition? As we read in their letters, they both believed in an afterlife and in a joyous reunion that friends would have there. Could it be that Jefferson, who had died earlier in the day, was there now to help John Adams or to escort him into the afterlife? Maybe Adams was able to see him or sense that he was present. I have no way of knowing for sure, and it's pure speculation, but it is interesting to think about. At about 6:20 p.m., Adams' heart stopped. A final clap of thunder shook the house, then the clouds parted and the sun broke through. John Quincy Adams, who was president at the time, was unaware that his father had died. He had to scramble back up to Massachusetts to be there. And writing in his diary, he wrote about the fact that his father and Thomas Jefferson both died on July 4th, and he said, "It was a visible and palpable manifestation of divine favor." I tend to agree with him. I hope you've enjoyed this special podcast, and I hope that whenever you celebrate the 4th of July, you'll remember John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. For further reading, I recommend the following books and articles: Faces of Revolution, Personalities and Themes in Struggle for American Independence by Bernard Bailyn. The Inner Jefferson, Portrait of a Grieving Optimist by Andrew Burstein. John Adams, Revolutionary Writings, 1775 to 1783, edited by Gordon Wood. John Adams, Revolutionary Writings, 1755 to 1775, edited by Gordon Wood. John Adams by David McCulloch. Thomas Jefferson, Writings, edited by Merrill D. Peterson. The Works of John Adams, Volume 10, Letters and State Papers, 1811 to 1825. Adams versus Jefferson, The Tumultuous Election of 1800 by John Ferling. Parties and Politics in the Early Republic, 1789 to 1815 by Morton Borden. The Adams Chronicles, 4 Generations of Greatness by Jack Shepard. In Pursuit of Reason, The Life of Thomas Jefferson by Noble E. Cunningham, Jr. The Early American Republic, 1789 to 1829 by Paul E. Johnson. Beyond Confederation, Origins of the Constitution and American National Identity. Edited by Richard Beeman, Stephen Botine, and Edward C. Carter. Growing Weary and Well-Doing, Thomas Jefferson's Life Among the Virginia Gentry by Ronald L. Hatzenbuehler. Published in the Virginia Magazine of History and Biography, Volume 1, Number 1, January 1993, and Growing Pains of the New Republic in 3 parts by Alexander de Conde, George L. Montague, and Joel Laras. Published in the William and Mary Quarterly, Volume 17, Number 3, July 1960.